In this video, I'm going to talk about the wiring harness that goes to the hydraulic section of the transmission. I'm not going to talk about this one here, which is the distance sensor and the speed sensor. When I get some better information about what's going on with these, I'll put that out. But for the moment, I'll just talk about this one, because this one's relatively simple. At the end of the video, I'll put up this, which is the thing that I've made, which is a cutout from the workshop manual. Now this is for the Boxster, so whether or not the pinouts at the TCU for the 911 or the Cayman is the same, I don't really know. But hopefully this should be a pretty good start. I can't see that it would be too much different, but basically what they've got in the workshop manual and what they call each of the pinouts is pretty difficult to understand. It doesn't make a whole bunch of sense in a lot of places. So what I did was I followed through where all these went to in the transmission, and then I worked out where they would actually pin out at the TCU. So if you need to check things at the TCU, what the pinout is here at the plug, what the internal wire colouring for all of these is. So hopefully you'll be able to test up relatively easily if things go wrong. So this harness connects to the solenoid, so the 8 solenoids that live along here, the 2 pressure sensors which would go there, so they're the clutch pressure sensors that sit behind the clutch pack, and finally the temperature sensor. So the simplest thing on here is the temperature sensor, and it's a thermistor with a positive thermal coefficient. It will have a resistance of about 1000 ohms at 25 degrees Celsius, about 1400 ohms at about 80 degrees Celsius. This just sits underneath the valve body and is immersed in oil. It just has a wire going to and from. The orange one is the one going to, and the white is the return, and it holds a common ground to the same white wires that come from the 2 pressure sensor plugs there. Even though that's orange there and that one's orange there, it's not the same orange when it gets to there. I'll put the pinouts again at the end of the video. From what I understand, this can be purchased as a replacement from Porsche, but interestingly, here is an old wiring harness out of what they call a 5HP19 ZF transmission, which is an old 5-speed box from about up to 25 years ago. As you can see, it's actually exactly the same sensor. I tested these and they behave exactly the same. So I can only assume that ZF have been using this exact same thing for years and years. So if Porsche are asking an absolute fortune for these, these are everywhere because they're just old transmissions, and they're probably out of so many of the old ZF boxes that if you just found an old harness like this off eBay, you just cut that off and just splice it in there without too much of a problem. For the solenoids, the way this would be numbered for the different solenoids, so you'd have EDS 1, 2, 3 and 4, EDS 5 and 6, and MV 1 and 2. Now interestingly, whilst these for the sensors do go to ground, because these go back to the grey plug on the TCM, there are 2 plugs, a black one and a grey one, and all the outputs and inputs from the transmission seem to go back to the grey one. So you can pull it apart and test things there. But if you follow through where these go through, the grounds for these actually do follow through to the black plug and go to ground. These don't. These are all sort of stopped internally. And whilst there's a red wire that comes from each of these, that's not a common wire, because there's a whole bunch of red wires going back here. And when you follow these all through, EDS1 is isolated by itself. So the to and from wire, so the supply and return wire, is for EDS1 only. EDS2 and EDS3 are on the same common return. So the red wires there and there are the same. And then all remainder, so EDS4, 5, 6 and MV1 and 2 have a common return. And I assume the reason that they have different return wires is to isolate just in case there are problems. So EDS1, it controls clutch 1, which is the big one and probably the most important of the 2 clutches, so it's all by itself. EDS2 controls clutch 2, and EDS3 controls pressure. So those 2 are obviously pretty important, so they've had those isolated. And EDS4 and the other 4 over here, I guess they consider for less important things. This is for lubrication and cooling, but you'll still get lubrication and cooling even if this completely fails. and these over here are for shift rod activation. So I guess that's why they have them separated. If you were to test the solenoid resistances, I would expect from MVs 1 and 2, I think the Porsche spec is between 10 and 12 ohms, and for all the EDS solenoids is between 5 and 6 ohms. And pretty much that's what I was getting from all of these. The pressure sensors for the clutches, there are 2 of those, which are those ones there. They're the same pressure sensors that I understand from the 9HP48 transmission. There's a dog clutch pressure transducer which is obtainable aftermarket. They are what I would be looking for there. The power supplies for these, the orange wires on those are a common 5 volt from the plug. The white ones are a common ground, which shares the same ground with the temperature sensor. And the signal wire is the center one of each of those, and this one's purple and that one there is red. It's going to be difficult to test these to see if they are working or not. I certainly don't know how to test these. But PWIS or some sort of diagnostics is going to tell you if one of these things has actually failed, one of the sensors. And obviously that requires you to remove the transmission and then the clutch pack to get access to change those over. If you do need to access the TCM in the Boxster, and I'm assuming it's probably going to be the same in the Cayman, no idea about the 911, but it lives in under there. You don't have to remove all of this, you can just pull this out, and I won't do it now, but you can pull this out. There's a big piece of foam that covers it, and just pull it off, and the 2 plugs, the grey and the black one, just sit right there, and you can just unplug those and test those as required. The plugs themselves are quite large and they have a latching lever on them. And you can split the 2. There are 2 sort of sub harnesses that go into it which you can remove, and they have all the pin out numbering on them, which makes it much easier to then stick pins in, etc., to test each of the elements down below.